Today we'll be talking about implementing an enterprise data management system for a large client. Environmental Standards is a privately held firm founded in 1987 with a national reputation with a Fortune 500 client base. We specialize in niche environmental consulting services, including chemistry, geosciences, and information technology. I'm Dan McCarthy. I'm the director of the Information Technology Practice here in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. I've been a consultant for over 26 years. I started my career as a field geologist and have been using EQUIS since 1997. Today we're going to be talking about an implementation that we did for an oil and gas client. And in this presentation, we're going to cover a little bit about the client's background and their objectives, some of the key issues that they faced as they were considering implementing EQUIS, our role as implementer, some of the steps that happened during implementation and examples of those steps, some lessons that we learned along the way with that implementation, and then some key takeaways that the client had following the implementation. So the client is a large multinational oil and gas company with over 200 facilities in North America. They currently have approximately 14 environmental programs that were going to be affected by the EQUIS implementation, and they're primarily focused in the midstream operations of the oil and gas industry, which includes pipelines, compressor stations, and gas storage facilities. The challenge was to implement a comprehensive data management program. They have multiple contractors involved. Currently, there are 5, and some of those contractors have changed over time. They had multiple laboratories also in play, 3 currently under contract. And it was important that we were able to keep them all on the same page. What they found was in the current implementation, prior to bringing EQUIS to the table, data was managed in different ways or not at all. There was limited data ownership, there was limited data accessibility, and they were having many, many challenges in getting data to their risk management group in order to properly assess the company's risk profile. So at the end of the day, what they really wanted to try and do is have a comprehensive data management program. So when they started thinking about how they wanted to implement EQUIS, they wanted to look at what they wanted to achieve following implementation. And those goals were, they wanted to be able to own their own data. They wanted to be able to standardize their processes across their entire portfolio. They wanted to leverage benefits that they achieved during the implementation process across all of their environmental programs. In other words, they didn't want to have any silos where information was being held and not being able to be leveraged elsewhere. They wanted to be able to visualize the solutions to their problems cost effectively as part of a larger initiative to use geographic information services inside their enterprise. And finally, they wanted to be able to reduce the cost of risk management within the company without sacrificing quality. So as part of the data ownership goal, they realized that what did they need to do to own their own data? They needed a solid management system, and in this case they chose EQUIS. They wanted to have established processes for managing that data, and they wanted to be able to have a governance model that allowed them to do things right. In other words, they wanted to have a programmatic approach to data management. From a standardization perspective, they wanted to be able to really nail down how data management processes occurred and able to use them effectively across a wide variety of programs. They also wanted to be able to have clearly defined responsibilities within each step of the organization so that everyone understood what their role was in the overall data management and ultimately risk management process. They also wanted to facilitate collaboration amongst their different programs, recognizing that all of them have a necessity for effective risk management. They wanted to be able to see benefits in one program and apply them where applicable to other programs. They also wanted to really visualize what their issues were in a variety of different ways. And this became increasingly important in their risk management circumstances because they wanted to be for senior management, they wanted to be able to show this in the most effective way possible. So what was the role of environmental standards in the implementation? Ultimately, our role was to stand up EQUIS inside their organization and assist them with the enforcement of their data management system. It began with building a governance model for the client to deploy, training of both the client's personnel as well as their contractors, assisting the client with migrating historical data into the ecosystem, oversight of the data management process in order to make sure that processes were being followed, and finally support in using a help desk in order to answer questions as they came up from either contractors, laboratories, or client personnel. So where did we start? We started with a project scoping meeting where we wanted to do several things. The first was identify our project stakeholders, and that included representation from the client's current contracting stable, their analytical laboratories, as well as end users of the data. And during that initial scoping meeting, it became pretty apparent that there was one individual who had a clear vision of what the program needed to encompass, and that person ultimately became the project sponsor. We also were able to assess the needs of the client and determine what components of the Equus ecosystem were necessary and which weren't. We also need to identify individual project requirements that may be necessary for regulatory guidance or for regulatory compliance so that they were built into the system as a whole. We also need to identify potential roadblocks, and these included things like resistance to change, contractor turnover, how to handle issues with data quality. And finally, once all those items were identified, we were able to effectively determine a path forward. So part of that, following that scoping meeting, and as part of our overall governance model, we developed some project documentation. And that included things like a data management plan, which clearly defined the roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders, described the workflow that was going to be employed, the specifications for electronic data deliverables, as well as who was going to be able to access the system. It also became pretty apparent that standard operating procedures were going to be needed. And in particular, one item that was of particular note was the need for a very clear SOP for nomenclature for sampling data. With the number of contractors that were involved and the employee turnover within those contractors, it became pretty clear that there may not be distinct sampling personnel year over year. So it became very clear that we needed to be able to have a standard operating procedure that was easy to follow and that could be employed very quickly in the field. Additionally, it became apparent that project guidance documents were going to be necessary as the client's personnel were going to be interfacing with the system directly. And that included things like database QC and completeness checking reports. So once data was collected, these reports would be run in order to be able to verify that the data set was complete for risk management purposes and that all the data met quality assurance standards. So let's talk a little bit more about data collection. As is usually the case when dealing with changes or issues that come up during the data collection process often end up further downstream and end up costing more money to solve. So there was a lot of discussion during the scoping meeting about how to handle the data collection process. Should it be done the manual process? Should an electronic process be used, such as Edge? In the end, the issue was the process is pretty simple. You develop a sample plan, you complete your field activities, you send your samples to the laboratory, and then you have to record all that information. And then that information then makes its way to the database. The client and the rest of the implementation team went back and forth about what was going to be the most effective method in order to be able to complete this data collection. And in the end, it became clear that going completely to and requiring electronic data collection was not feasible, and a completely manual process was also not feasible. So in the end, we decided we weren't going to herd cats, and the solution was to require an electronic data deliverable, but the method to complete that electronic data deliverable was left up to the contractor. but the format and the valid values and other associated elements were promulgated in the data management plan by the client. The end result was it afforded the client the opportunity to look and see who would be most effective with collecting data electronically and who would be the most effective doing it manually. Another aspect of the implementation was historic data migration. This is often the thing that tends to give prospective implementation clients some pause, in that there's a lot of data that sits in the past, and it can be often very expensive to consider how it's going to get into the database. For this particular client, we implemented a phased approach. We looked at the scope of all the data that needed to be migrated and then broke it into a series of phases. Phase one encompassed analytical laboratory data, where the analytical lab, in concert with environmental standards, developed an approach to be able to load that data into the database. Phase two involved the client's personnel in concert with their contractors because they had the most institutional knowledge. And finally, phase three was the coordinates for historic locations, which was completed with the client's personnel in concert with environmental standards in order to be able to leverage the ability to visualize the historical data effectively. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Looking back at the breakdown of what the historical samples look like, you can see that the majority of the data was soil or solids. So this involved a certain amount of field data, including sample depths, whether it was a composite or a grab, and those types of things were best handled by the client's personnel because they had the most institutional knowledge. As you can see from this graph, there were a number of other different types of media of varying matrices. So looking at the scope of the historic data completed to date, we can see that the number of facilities starting in 2013 was relatively small and collected about 5,500 samples that were migrated into the system. What we found year over year is we looked at the data that was collected and migrated, and we took what we learned about that migration process and applied it to data moving forward. So this horizontal learning allowed us to achieve about a 50% savings in data migration costs moving forward year over year. Currently to date, we've migrated about 25,000 samples into the database over approximately 56 facilities. And this historical migration continues to be ongoing. So what we learned as part of the historical data migration that goes back to the story of the tortoise and the hare. In this case, slow and steady won the race. By taking our time in the historical data migration process, we were able to achieve substantial cost savings over just trying to move all the data in as quickly as possible. I'd like to talk a little bit about historical spatial data import. The client identified as an initiative that they wanted to fully leverage GIS systems going forward as part of their risk management strategy. And they had a number of figures that were in hard copy that they wanted to be able to leverage inside the database. So what they did is they asked environmental standards to come up with a process to take that data and get it into the system in a timely manner. This slide represents how the workflow that occurs. So historical maps were digitized. They were then geoprocessed using ArcGIS, which in turn allowed us to generate a series of coordinates, which were then imported into the database and then verified by the contractor that originally did the work or by client personnel if that contractor was no longer under contract, and then finally was able to be visualized inside the Equus Enterprise system. The other issue that was addressed during implementation was oversight. And we were able to leverage the use of Equus Enterprise dashboards and able to give an at-a-glance view of not only individual facilities and what was going on, but also the performance of analytical laboratories in terms of data loading, and as well as contractor performance based on using the contractor dashboard. These dashboards made extensive use of the traffic light function, which basically gave an at-a-glance check that data was being imported in a timely manner and accurately. Additionally, one requirement that the client had was to be able to assess the value of the implementation over time. So in concert with the client, we determined that a project status dashboard would be deployed and would be updated quarterly. This is an example of that dashboard, and it leverages a number of different things. The information on the right-hand side is captured from Equus and is pulled into the dashboard in order to be able to assess how the data loading process is going, both current data as well as historical data. The overall project task was using a stoplight model, was used to assess whether the project was on schedule, and then finally to identify significant accomplishments and upcoming activities. And again, this is for reporting up to senior management. So what were the keys to success during this implementation? First was we recognized that we couldn't herd cats, because that would end up being an exercise in futility. But overarching issue was that we wanted to determine that as long as the process was understood, the mechanism to get there could be flexible. We also identified that it was better to be a tortoise, not a hare, in terms of historical data migration, because cost savings was achieved. We further saw that by actively providing oversight to the contractors and laboratories and not doing the work for them, and allowed them to gain some knowledge about how the process worked and become more familiar, which in turn made them more efficient. We also found that ongoing communication with the client and with the project team via the dashboards and the project status dashboard was crucial to success, because it allowed everyone to see the status at any given time. And then finally, we also found that we were able to use the system and configure it effectively as opposed to writing custom tools. This enabled the system to weather upgrades to Equus with little to no downtime. So what were our takeaways during this implementation? One, we felt that the client champion with a clear vision was key. And this gave not only ownership by the client, but also they were able to put forth the implementation as a success with sufficient documentation to demonstrate that. What we also found is by doing focus training in concert with EarthSoft, we were able to see significant savings in terms of support time, because everyone was getting the same training at the same time and was effective in showing how the system would work effectively. What we also found was that proactive oversight and identifying issues up front was more valuable than just having a support help desk alone. By keeping in front of the contractor and the analytical laboratory with deadlines and identifying issues, it enabled us to avoid any significant disruptions in data loading or data management. And also the takeaway that the level of adoption enthusiasm among contractors and project team members can be variable. And it goes back to that issue about herding cats. Not everyone is going to fully embrace a system like this, but if everyone recognizes that everyone has a role to play in risk management, then they can achieve success. So some of the takeaways by the numbers. We saw a 50% reduction in their historical data migration costs year over year through that horizontal learning process. By using the historical data capture workflow, they were able to see a 30 to 40% reduction in their map production costs. And this led to significant savings and as well as a better product in terms of the risk management review. And then finally, they saw approximately an 86% reduction in their internal costs for their risk assessment and risk management process by implementing Equus. So here we were provided a very nice testimonial by the client representative indicating that they were pleased with the role that environmental standards had and the role that Equus played in allowing them to gain back ownership of their data, controlling their quality, ensuring compliance, and effectively managing their environmental risk. This is an ongoing project. We continue to see enhanced oversight and support now and in the future. We are continuing to enroll additional programs here in 2016, and we're continuing to migrate data, historical data. And the overall goal is that it'll be over a 5-year plan. We're in year 4. And we're hoping, and the client is hopeful as well, to be able to integrate Equus into other client processes that will enable them to leverage that data and gain maximum value. And then finally, we continue to refine the metrics and the key performance indicators as indicated on the project dashboard to track the project progress so that the client sponsor can effectively present the value that this brought to their upper management. My name is Dan McCarthy, Director of Information Technology and Environmental Standards. Thank you very much for your time.